Is that someone else you've let in? Stephen House. Live streamed, God help me.
Okay, it looks like our participants list has stabilized. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Wednesday Labour Mobility Research Seminar. I'm Ryan Edwards, Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre, and hosting here with me today, I have Archika Okazaki. As always, I would first like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we are broadcasting from. For those of you unfamiliar with the Centre, we are a think and do tank focused on improving the effectiveness of Australian aid, supporting the development of PNG and the Pacific Island region, and contributing to much better global development policy. Today, we have our very own Dr. Michael Rose presenting Development and the Pacific Labour Scheme, a longitudinal survey of Timorese applicants and participants. Mike is an anthropologist and a research fellow at the Development Policy Centre and the Crawford School of Public Policy, and he's currently focused on Pacific labour mobility, and in particular that from Timor-Leste. Mike's going to present for around half an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A. We do welcome important or clarifying questions throughout, but I would urge you, if you can resist, to please hold them, because we are going to hold a proper Q&A at the end. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, I guess I'm not muted, am I? No, hello? No,
you are good to go.
There we go. I actually thought it was 40 minutes, not 30 minutes. So anyway, we'll just see how it goes. I'm sure it'll be fine.
That's fine. Yep.
Look, Ryan, thank you so much for introducing me. As my wonderful colleague, Dr. Ryan Edwards, has just pointed out, my name is Dr. Michael Rose. I'm an anthropologist and a research fellow here at the ANU's Development Policy Centre. The research that is the basis of this seminar today is part of a broader ethnographic project whereby I've been following the life and times, so to speak, of around 30 to deploy to Australia as part of the Pacific Labour Scheme, the PLS. They're working these days at a meatpacking plant on the south coast of Australia in the state of Victoria, in a green and windy town called Warrnambool. There's a lot of complexity and instructive ethnographic colour to the lives of these workers in Australia, which I do get into in some of my other work. But the better part of this presentation will be a results of a longitudinal group in Warrnambool and among a mirrored cohort in Dili, with the aim of measuring, how involvement in the PLS is affecting the material circumstances of Timorese households. Before I proceed to the data, however, excuse me, there we go. Before I proceed to the data, however, it's probably useful to enter into some discussion of the context in which this work is taking place. To begin with, perhaps a quick name check of anthropology and a discussion of the methodological context. So, although the word anthropology is fairly well known, there's actually a lot of confusion about what it is. This is understandable because in the past 100 years it's been around, it's been a lot of different things. Needless to say, presumably that cliche of some sweaty character in a safari suit trekking through the jungle was probably never very accurate and is definitely not accurate in describing my own work, especially here. What anthropology today is essentially a jumping off point for research that values the idea that even in a globalized world, maybe especially in a globalized world, discrete groups continue to have distinct frameworks for making sense of life, giving meaning to what they do, and envisaging what they want. So, to give the simplest and most relevant possible explanation, When I work with the Timorese in Warrnambool or elsewhere as part of my research here at the ANU, the question I ask myself is not so much how does their work contribute to development in Timor-Leste, so much as what does the term development mean in the Timorese context, and how can Australian or other policymakers who are interested support that? Let me illustrate this with my own involvement in research on Timor. As much as I'm quick to dismiss the cliche of the sweaty anthropologist trekking through the jungle, I actually did begin my academic career doing PhD field work in some very remote mountains in a place in the west of Timor-Leste called Oikusi district. And what I was looking at there in particular harvest. The people I was living among practiced moving agriculture. They would cut a small garden from the forest each year on the steep mountain slopes, and they lived in an often arid place where finding enough labor to bring in the harvest was a problem, and survival really relied on managing conflict and working together. The harvest ritual I was studying basically took the form of an all-day picnic. People from the village would gather at a sacred place in the forest, each bringing a little basket, say some prayers, and sit down together on mats to eat with each other and, they believed, the ancestors. Often it would be quite noisy because one of the ideas of this gathering was that any tension in the village which had gone unresolved in the year would be discussed and a solution would be found. There were very few fences or anything like that, so disputes often arose over who had a right to which garden and things like that. Whatever the issues were, they had to be fixed. After all the arguments had been had, the men would walk further up the hill to a sacred cave where they would pour their little baskets of rice into a big basket of rice, which would then be mixed together by the village's wise man and handed back to everyone for them to take home. So as you can all see, the metaphor of this ceremony was pretty clear. It was about the importance of moral unity, of standing together, of collective effort, and that individual economic productivity done right should contribute to the greater good. What initially surprised me when I ended up moving down from the mountains and doing research in Oikusi's town was the degree to which people in urban Timor, for people in urban Timor, this semi-ritualized communalism remained important. That is to say, even people who in the town who had a job as a public servant and were making money as individuals were driven primarily by the imperative to fulfill their duties to extended family. See Rose 2020. Just kidding. But you can get the book if you want. Anyway, coming back to labour migration, what we found in this survey is that the same principles continue to hold true when Timorese people come to Australia on programs such as the PLS. In other words, what our data suggests is that what looks to most Australian stakeholders like a program that is intended to give individuals a chance to earn money is experienced by its participants mostly as an opportunity to feed back into a fundamentally collective system. None of this is to say that the aims of Timorese PLS workers, as we understand them from this survey, were at odds with those of Australian policy thinkers and makers, but it is worth recognising that they do come from by our respondents. For example, funding the education of children or siblings, or the improvement of housing stock, actually do align neatly with the conventional ideas of what development in Timor-Leste looks like. Other aims expressed by Timorese workers we surveyed, which I'll talk about, for example, contributing to the ritual economy of bride wealth and feasting, are essential to workers' ideas of economic and social success, but are difficult for outsiders to understand. Still other aspirations motivations expressed by workers and reflected in the survey, notably that of studying in Australia or settling here with families, are actively prohibited by the terms of the Pacific Labour Scheme. Australian development thinking and that of the workers we surveyed may sometimes coincide. But if we're going to be creating informed policy, we must avoid the mistake of assuming they're the same. Okay, so having established the broadly collectivist nature of Timorese life and work and thought about what that might mean in the context of labour migration, let's quickly touch on two other things we really need to understand before we can get into the data. The nature of the labour market. These are the nature of the labour market from which the workers are coming and Australia's temporary migration programs more generally. Okay, now we see if my slides are going to work. Aha, success. Okay, despite the high hopes with which their nation was founded, after decades of struggle, young people in Timor-Leste today face a fairly difficult future. As you can see from this excellent chart made up by our friends at Lau Hamiltuk, about 75% of the population are either students, unemployed, engaged in subsistence agriculture, or various sorts of small, often fairly precarious business enterprises. In reality, most people appear to juggle a variety of livelihood strategies. They hustle, so to speak, falling back on their communities and their connections, just doing whatever they need to get by. As you can hopefully see from the slide, in fact, you may not be able to because it's such a small percentage of the population, just 2% of the population is either working or studying abroad. I actually feel like it might be slightly more than that, but at any rate, it's not much. This doesn't seem like much in comparison with better established labour-sending countries, but when you have a look at the chart and consider that it is about a third the number of people who work for the government, it is clear to see how working abroad has become a significant part of both the national economy and the national imagination. I'm sorry for that hiccup, guys. We just had a slight computer problem. Okay, we're back on track. That was a worry. Okay, glad I'm still here. Back to where we were. Good. Okay, so to reiterate, 2% of Timorese working overseas, 6% work for the government. As you can see, it looks like a small number, but it's actually very significant. At present, the majority of Timorese working abroad are in the UK, where some 20,000 have travelled using Portuguese passports, to which those who were born before the nation's restoration of formal independence in 2002 are entitled. There are also two government-run programs. One is sending people to South Korea, and the other, which we're obviously discussing today, sends people to Australia, the Seasonal Worker Program and the Pacific Labour Scheme. The Seasonal Worker Program is basically picking fruit for 6 to 9 month stints. The Pacific Labour Scheme is 3-year periods of work, mostly in primary industries in regional Australia. Together, people working in all these programs send home an estimated $100 million a year, and even that may be an underestimate as it only counts money remitted using formal mechanisms. Before we progress to a closer look at part 1 of our PLS survey, there are a number of interesting features to be taken from this chart, which I think we should just quickly run by. The first is that while people in Timor-Leste are not in formal employment, it is also imperative to note that they are not inactive. As I said earlier, they're occupied for the most part with activities that are often ecologically or economically precarious and ultimately intended to improve the circumstances of those undertaking them, whether that be through a new crop of corn, a new generation of educated young people, or the continued beneficent goodwill of the ancestors. Working abroad, we will show, isn't a way of divesting oneself from activities such as these, so much as attempting to support their success and mitigate the risks associated with them. That is to say, work in Australia plugs in directly to all the other activities which you see on this chart. The second is that the number of people in education, 25%, as you can see there. This speaks to both the youth of the population and the value that's placed on schooling. Once again, it underlies the utility of work in Australia as part of a broader collective strategy to develop the extended family's ability to look after its own. One might call it an investment in social capital. Third is the magnitude of the task at hand for Timor-Leste in finding employment for its young. Despite attempts to promote coffee and tourism as mainstays of the national economy, these haven't succeeded yet. I hope they do. And there is not any big industry or activity which people can pursue as a way of improving their status in the world. This is especially true for the young and educated. So what do people do? Well, as the chart shows, they farm, they run little businesses, they dream about setting up larger businesses, they look after children and elderly parents. The argument that this research makes is that although the number of Timorese workers in Australia is never going to be as significant in terms of its overall population, it does have the ability to have a disproportionate and positive impact on development there by supporting people in Timor in the things that they already do. Okay, let's try and go to the next slide. There we go. What is the PLS? Okay, so now we move on to the PLS itself, the Pacific Labour Scheme. The Pacific Labour Scheme began in 2018. It's a temporary migration program intended to give workers from 9 Pacific countries and Timor-Leste a chance to work in Australia for up to 3 years and I don't know if you can see my air quotes, low and semi-skilled occupations. As you can see from the slide here, there's 2,500 PLS workers in Australia at present, including 100 from Timor-Leste. Moving slides here. Oh dear. There we go. The research presented here is based on the first part of a longitudinal survey, which was conducted between November 2020 and February 2021. It is intended to measure the difference that the PLS specifically will make to material conditions in Timorese households. We had 103 respondents, 76 of whom were people who had applied for the PLS, but not been selected, 27 of whom were working in Australia. So I'm not sure if I made that entirely clear. 76 were still in Timor, 27 were here. As would be expected of a longitudinal survey, in 2022, we hope to do the second part, to survey everyone again, to measure in a material sense the difference that work in Australia has made to Timorese households. Do children with worker parents get more or better schooling than those who don't? Does money from abroad improve their nutrition? Are spouses of PLS workers more likely to run a small business? How is the employment of young people and women changing family life in cultures where decision makers have customarily been older and male? These are all issues that dovetail with Australia's commitment to development in the Pacific and Timor-Leste, and inform debates over the role that temporary migration, and indeed migration in general, might play in it. But the baseline data, which we're presenting here, has a different sort of value, primarily that of helping us better understand the push and pull factors that motivate people to work in Australia and the frameworks that are likely to determine the answers to the questions referred to above. We collected information on age, family composition, education, previous work experience abroad, employment history, involvement and investment in ritual activities, and household wealth, as well as asking respondents to explain in their own words what they hope to gain by applying. So just a little on how the actual project went down. I was introduced to the Timorese PLS workers of Warrnambool by an individual I knew from my previous fieldwork in Timor-Leste on the SWP, who was then subsequently employed by the PLS. He was not only happy to see a friendly face in this unfamiliar country, but was also very generous in introducing me to his friends. As it happens, my family lived not all that far from Warrnambool, so before I knew it, I found myself traveling there quite often to get to know the Timor-Leste community, who very graciously hosted me. I would attend mass with them, go fishing, eat pizza, play football, play cards. It was really quite a good time, as well as being productive in terms of sort of getting to know everyone better. It became, as tends to be the way in anthropology, and especially in Timor-Leste, a relationship based on reciprocity. If there was something community members, especially the ones I became close to, needed to understand about Australia, I would try and help them. If there was something I needed to understand about the PLS or Timor-Leste, they would help me. Asking people to fill in this long and detailed survey was a big ask, but I had two advantages. One was this relationship of trust and reciprocity I built with them. The other was, in spite of in the spirit of the broadly collectivist ethos I've just described, that the community were receptive to my explanation of what I was doing, that we hoped the data we collected would help inform an Australian migration policy that would be better for them and their compatriots. Moving on to the next slide here. Let's move to the next one. Oh, well, there was supposed to be a photo of my research assistant, but oh, there he is. Hello. There we go. Say hello to Sisto. So recruiting our 76 research participants in Timor-Leste was slightly more difficult. But once again, as tends to happen, it was a matter of leveraging networks. In this case, through some prior research, I had come to know a remarkable young man, Sisto Sarmento, who had previously applied for the PLS, but hadn't got in. So we engaged him to link up with my pre-established Warrnambool contacts and seek out people they knew of in Dili who had also applied but not gotten into the program. Often it was neighbours or friends or something like that of people who were already working in Australia. Dili is such a small place and so permeated by social media that it turns out that just about everyone knew everyone anyway. What we were aiming for was what I call a mirror sample, a larger but otherwise similar cohort in Dili to the group of people who had been selected in terms of educational background and gender. Okay, so let's move on to the results, and I'll move slides. Demographic profile. Okay, that's it. Okay.
Mark, just a heads up, we've just passed the halfway mark, in case you're wondering.
Oh, thank you. And oh, we're about halfway too. That's going to work out pretty well. Thanks, Ryan. Great work.
No worries.
Okay, so let's move on to a discussion of the results. Yep. So to begin with, as I think of these people, 27 were successful applicants, and the remaining 76 were mostly in Dili, people who had applied to the PLS but not quite gotten in. I feel a little uneasy using the word successful, unsuccessful, because I think everyone deserved it equally, but anyway, that's the word we're using. The average age was 28. Applicants ranged between 19 years old and 44 years old, although everyone selected was between 25 and 39, possibly reflecting the tendency of Australian employers to pick people who combined being still fairly young and healthy with being old enough to have some experience working abroad, or alternately with an INGO. 87% of the 103 people we surveyed were male, which was a similar proportion to those eventually selected. Possibly this obvious bias reflects a changing but still prevalent attitude in Timor-Leste that working outside the home and providing financially is a male prerogative, although it might also be that the Australian employer, the Meatworks in Warrnambool, was biased towards employing men for a job which requires a great deal of heavy lifting. Not that women can't do that, but that seemed to be the way the employer was thinking. Moving slides here. Oh, good. there we go. One thing we found that was really particularly significant in terms of the relationship of this sort of work with development in Timor-Leste, in my opinion, the vast majority, 91%, described Dili as their ordinary place of residence at the time of application. However, only 17% describe Dili as their place of birth or their home village. This is interesting in a number of ways. One is simply because countries of a comparable size and post-conflict is seeing extreme percentage of that population living in urban areas, simply young people being attracted to opportunity in the city. Education, connectivity, a taste for adventure, almost all of them seemingly seem to give rise to an interest in working outside the country. And although we think about this, may be tempted to think about this in terms of Timor-Leste's status here, that this is also the case in developed countries, where young people also seek fairly media work abroad, almost as a rite of passage. I occasionally like to talk about my time working on an Israeli chicken farm, which was pretty horrifying, really. And it was short-staffed because all the Israeli kids had apparently left to work in tulip warehouses in the Netherlands. And I don't know where the Dutch kids had gone, but my theory is they'd all gone to Australia. But the point is that young people sort of like to travel abroad, to work abroad, to sort of explore the work. Presentation is putting the Timor-Leste case. There is some merit in also just thinking about this as sort of a universal sort of human developmental thing. Anyway, okay. The rural origins of the workers is interesting when considered in the context of the communalism which we've discovered before. What it means is that the PLS is, by default, a very effective conduit for Australian money to make its way to the outlying districts. And when we consider that Timor-Leste's other two big economic mainstays, oil and aid, are absolutely notorious for concentrating wealth in the capital, it actually begins to look like a pretty good method for addressing rural poverty. Just changing slides here. There we go. Another really striking thing we found was the degree to which PLS participants were educated. Now, the PLS is, in theory, intended to recruit low and semi-skilled labour. Once again, air quotes. The type of jobs which the workers are doing are generally not those which would require in Australia. Still, as you can see from that chart, no less than 77.5% of the applications had a university degree, and the rest had all graduated from high school. Naturally, one issue that comes up here is brain drain, and it is an understandable perspective. However, in this case, in my view, it doesn't really stand up. Although Timor-Leste has done an amazing job of educating its population, jobs for the graduates are simply not there. So without migration, without this outlet, all we're really seeing is educated young people who are frustrated because the things they aspire to, whether that be more education, having the money to start a small business. One of the workers I spoke to recently, who is hoping to stay on if he can, which it seems like he can't, but let's see what happens, told me, look, if I go home, Mike, I'm just going to Timor-Leste. Workers that we've surveyed here seem to see their labour in Australia as enhancing their ability to contribute to it, just the opposite. Speaking of unemployment, the situation of the workers was slightly paradoxical. To begin with, it is very difficult to find work in Timor-Leste, and for most people, it's almost impossible. Employment in Timor-Leste was 13% in 2015, but those with a university education are 1.9 times more likely to be unemployed, and those in Dili are 4 times more likely to be jobless. Considering the vast majority of PLS participants fit into all these categories, you can see why they're keen to join up and find some work in Australia. Interestingly, though, one thing that came out in the survey responses was that about half the PLS applicants had actually been in some other form of employment before they applied. I mean, what seems to be happening here is that the wages in Australia are simply better. So obviously that's where people are going. Once again, though, I would like to reiterate that for a well-educated, resourceful individual leaving Timor to work in Australia under the PLS, even permanently migrating, does not mean that Timor is losing someone who would have stayed on and been equally productive there. Without seed capital, demoralized by low pay or insecure work, it's very difficult for these workers, it seems, to contribute in the ways that they would really like to. Rather, what PLS workers appear to be doing is effectively enabling family networks from which they've come to look after themselves. In a small communal country such as Timor-Leste, where the government often has, as they say, limited capacity, there is a lot to be said for this. We also see an interesting pattern when we look at the employment backgrounds of those who were selected by the PLS. I don't think we have a chart for this, but I'll just read through it. No less than 19 of them had had previous experience as fruit pickers in Australia under the seasonal worker program. 2 had worked in the UK, and many of the others had had various forms of contact with international NGOs. Clearly, what we're seeing in terms of these labour migration programs, but also Timor-Leste's international engagement over the past 20 years, is opportunity. Foreign employers clearly value workers with experience of working abroad, not to mention the language skills that they pick up from doing so. I think in terms of thinking about the impact of labour migration on Timor-Leste's workforce, one interesting positive that we could consider is the degree to which it sort of equips its young people to sort of get along in an increasingly globalized world. Just changing slides here. There we go. Future plans for business and education. Also noteworthy is the common aspiration of workers to use money earned in Australia to further their own education and start businesses. Clearly, they see their presence in Australia working at these fairly meaningful jobs as part of a larger strategy, usually undertaken in conjunction with their family de-integrated to improve their situation. This is in spite of the distance between them. As you can see, the aspiration to start a small business is fairly universal. And it's also very common to seek out further education, including, interestingly, in Australia and Indonesia. So once again, what appears to be happening here is that people are using the money sent back from Australia to sort of build for themselves this international life. You have money from Australia, education from Indonesia or Australia in some cases, all to be used in creating a Timorese future. It's also interesting to see that these aspirations, which I've been talking about, the greater education and a better life, are almost never taken in isolation. When we allow respondents to reply in free text to the question of what they wanted to do in Australia, whether they were focused on schooling, business attainment, better quality of life. The answer was almost always couched in terms of their collective responsibilities. So I'll just flip through here. I think we've got a few of them. There we go. They mention education, a better life, and family. And because I want to change my life and development the next generation, because I am from a poor family and I want to change my family life. Because I am a chief of the family, I want to get a better life so that I can support my families as well as get education for and other people as well. So once again, collectivity is key to the development impact of these programs. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that this presentation is primarily drawing from survey data, not ethnographic data. But I think it's worth just pausing here to include a little color in terms of how the particular group of 35 people I came to know in Warrnambool saw the world about them. I think what's interesting is that these were not people who were just sort of going to work in Australia and focused on nothing else. I mean, their work was heavy and they were often very tired, but what really strikes anyone in meeting them is what sort of curious and active young people they are. They all seem to have these different projects going on with this remarkable degree of sort of intellectual interest. One guy is an Esperantist of all things. So he likes sort of sitting in sort of online meetings, more or less like this, speaking Esperanto. Another guy is making videos for a Catholic environmentalist movement. Another one, goodness help him, is investing in Bitcoin. Another one has gotten into long distance bike rides and is saving some of his money for a new bike. Yet another keeps on talking about this credit union he's going to start when he gets home. And he's always looking around for online courses he can do in Australia to sort of improve his ability to do that. All this is to say that it's about skilled workers as being in any way in a dead-end job. I mean, perhaps that's maybe how some Australians would see ending up working at a meatworks. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But for these Timorese, work as sort of low-skilled, perhaps even low-status labour is just a step to better things. Not only are these workers full of ideas about how to improve their future, but they also tend to be curious individuals who are eager to learn about the world around them. There needs to be an acknowledgement in Australia, but particularly in Timor-Leste, that programs such as the PLS to be really effective as a driver of development, there are only really two things needed. One, they need to be bigger. There is an enormous demand. More people would come if they had the opportunity. The other is that sending countries need to establish a better environment for the money to be remitted into. Clearly, there are no shortage of ideas. Okay, getting to the end of the presentation here, we move on to another perennial Timor-Leste studies topic, which is adat. In other words, custom. New Guinea-orientated people, I believe the word is wantok, but it's not exactly the same. So another recurring theme was the importance of customary giving and feasting, sometimes glossed in the literature using the Indonesian loanword adat and referred to in Tetun as lisan. Now, this is actually a really difficult topic in policy thinking, insofar as it's generally outside the experience of anyone thinking about it, of anyone sort of who's been brought up in Australia or anywhere like that. It's also an entire system that really needs to be lived. It's insoluble, in my opinion. And in fact, I think it's arguably safer for foreign researchers not to engage closely with the ritual economy. That said, for anyone with an interest in Timor-Leste or the Pacific, where equivalents exist, it's important to know what these systems are and what they aren't. So what we found in this survey was simply that helping pay for ceremonies, ritual gifting and feasts are very important to pretty much all the PLS workers in Australia. In Timor-Leste, these payments tend to be mediated through a system broadly known as balake. This most notably involves the practice of giving bride wealth, which is a huge issue in itself. But it's at its simplest, it's where a groom's family makes payments, most famously in Buffalo, to the family of his bride. Although, as the excellent anthropologist Kelly De Silva, among others, has pointed out, such overt payments are not really transactions so much as ways of initiating a relationship in which the groom, and by extension his family, are symbolically in debt to the bride's family and obliged to help them out, both in terms of affording them a certain amount of deference, but also in terms of material stuff. Most prescriptively, this is done through providing cattle and other goods for funeral and wedding feasts. And indeed, not to do so would be sort of risk being seen as stingy, possibly even ostracized. But it also extends to a broader sort of relationship. So if the bride's people are in need of money or needing the right connections or to get something done, hands for the harvest, it's generally the done thing that the groom's family has to help them out. The point is, however, that the overt feasting or material aid is just a metaphor for a broader sort of applied sociality that holds the social and economic world of Timor-Leste as a distinct polity together. So, unsurprisingly, virtually all of the respondents discuss these types of payments as being important. 80 of them identified bride wealth as their greatest expenditure in terms of the customary economy, while 12 listed traditional ceremonies, which might have actually been the same thing. Once again, though, it's important to keep in mind that this is just the most visible part of a much broader and generally ongoing relationship.
Hey, Mike, we're just about out of time, so let's wrap up in the next minute or so, okay?
Yeah, I think we're going to make it. Okay, thanks. It might be closer to 5, but I'll talk quick.
I'll cut you off in 2.
Oh, 2. Okay, well.
We want some time for Q&A.
Speak extra quick. Thanks, Ryan. Outlining how difficult this area can be to study, we had some difficulties in asking about dollar terms here. Although people are sometimes willing to, were sometimes willing to give us numbers, it was generally considered crass to talk about because your motivations for IDAC are not supposed to be about money. $190, that was in the 6 months before anyone left for Australia, right? And the maximum was 5,000. So in the second part of this longitudinal survey, what will really be interesting is whether or not this changes. I could see ways which would go either way. So Ryan, if you're listening in, this is the last paragraph. A final point which is worth making is the desire for permanent settlement and the question about the degree to which it would be disruptive to all of the patterns discussed above. In terms of the survey, it was difficult to get a handle on the appetite for permanent over temporary migration, but certainly people see, and as the 3-year tenure of this first group gets closer, that only seems to be increasing. I think there's a couple of things to think about here, which is that it's interesting that even when we're talking about temporary migration, nobody expressed a desire to divest themselves from these Timorese is that even if this group was to status in Australia, even if the PLS was to become the seed for a new diaspora, what we would probably see is this sort of community continuing almost as an outposted, sort of as a Timorese outpost in Australia, feeding money back in to the different sorts of economic, customary, social activities that are taking place offshore. Okay, I believe I've had a little bit more to say, but I believe that I've actually run out of time. So we'll finish up there. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope it didn't chop out too much or anything like that.
No, perfect, Mark. Good timing. Thank you. So yeah, big thanks to Mark. Let's now please move on to questions. Everyone, can you please now pop your videos back on so we can see everyone? And so it just feels a little bit less lectury. I normally like having the videos on while we present, but yeah, we did it before in the interest of trying to preserve what limited bandwidth we had. Please do, if you have questions, please do use the raise hand button. So the Zoom is set up as a meeting, so you'll find that under the reactions. And then I can allow you to say your question, we can unmute, or if you prefer just to post in the chat, maybe you don't have great reception where you are, you can do that and then I'll moderate the questions in. And yeah, and please also do briefly introduce yourself if we do come to you. So I'm looking for hands. They should come up in the participant list now.
Ryan, mate, can you turn the video on for me?
Oh, I have to allow, do we have to allow everyone?
Oh, I can't do it myself.
Oh.
Oh, wait, start my video. There we go.
Okay.
Feel disorientated.
I'm giving a few seconds looking for hands. Okay, I'll weave in first the first question, which has come from Michelle Harmer. She's asked, how will your research improve the outcomes and deficiencies in PLS programs, i.e. advocate for better conditions, or how workers are treated? The link between advocacy and research, an interesting question. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. It's that, like, whether or not this paper here was actually focused on the way in which work in Australia sort of supports the things people are already doing in Timor-Leste. However, I sort of quite regularly publish blogs and things, and I've got another series of articles coming out, well, another couple of articles coming out, which do actually focus on the issue of worker conditions and welfare. In terms of how my broader research will improve that, I think just the more information we have out there, the fairer the results we're going to see. I mean, that's part of the reason why this research is funded. I hope that was a...
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much, Michael. I just part of the seasonal workers program in supporting seasonal workers in country Victoria, just as as part of a friendship group. And one of the things we see is that there's some very, very high expectations that we would like to see with the seasonal workers to be able to have a fair win-win situation whereby their development is really fair, and that they have opportunities to develop what they want to develop, either back home in Timor-Leste or, their future aspirations. And there's a lot of barriers and a lot of employment conditions which make it really hard for them. And I'm just going to let that there, because I actually think this research could really, support better labour conditions, and also maybe look at, I was sort of thinking employment agencies around agriculture being established by Timorese people themselves here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Look, it's all great ideas. I mean, I think one thing to comment is that, and one thing which maybe this, I mean, especially as an anthropologist trying to understand what people are actually going through, this isn't easy for anyone, are completely at sea. Like, it's hard to sort of explain just how different Timor-Leste is from Australia. And the same thing for an Australian dropped in Timor-Leste, even though we have money, so we have privilege. But at the same time, when you're talking about people coming from such different sort of areas, there's invariably problems. And one of the things I think is great about the PLS, and one of the reasons I would like to push for people to be able to stay on as long-term migrants, is that sort of this process of becoming adjusted to Australia doesn't happen quickly. So if we're going to have people get the most out of their stay here, these short temporary visits have their limitations. Thanks, Michelle. Oh, by the way, you've got my email address, get in touch and we'll talk more. Thanks.
Okay, next up we have Grant. I muted you a moment ago, Grant, but I'll ask you to unmute yourself again.
Thanks for unmuting me while I was telling my kids to spread peanut butter on their toast. Look, I won't put the video on. Look, thanks, Mike, for a very good presentation. That was all very interesting. I wonder about the relationship between the people that you've spoken to and the broader population of people who are working through or have come out through the PLS. A lot of the statistics you've presented are from your sample, and a portion of the sample at least was kind of snowballing sample. So, I was wondering if you could reflect on how different your sample is to the broader population and what those differences might mean for how you interpret the data that you presented. But
yeah,
thanks.
Thanks, Grant. Look, when this gets written up into a paper, in fact, it's partly written up into a paper, but this is one thing I should sort of convey more clearly, is that the particular sample I'm dealing with are actually a fairly privileged lot. I mean, their employer has had sort of problems, is by no means perfect, but at the same time is certainly doing their best by the this PLS group. They're living in a town with a very supportive local church and a priest who's very good. Their leader is just their sort of elected leader from among them is just a inspirational man. And even the place they're living in is this great sort of university dorm sort of situation with the beach just down the road. Now, what the situation is when you're sort of like living in Wagga Wagga West and like people in your group don't get on and you're completely disenfranchised from the community much, well, possibly it wouldn't be as positive an experience. And so I guess one of the limitations of anthropology is that we can sort of drill down to, look at a specific group. But when we sort of, come to look at the sort of bigger phenomena of labour sending, definitely I'm going to have to contextualize that, my data with the broader literature, which people like Anne Wigglesworth, who I see there, Andrew McWilliam, Annie Wu, amongst others, are all doing some great work in this area. Victoria Steed, many people. It's great. Okay.
So
Thanks,
in other
Grant.
words, some of your, sorry, I was just going to say, just to follow up very quickly, just going to say, so some of your conclusions about the what the educational attainment, for example, of your population means for the broader experience of the PLS might change, given that this sample might not represent a broader cohort of people who are engaged in the PLS.
Yeah, I divide that question into two. In terms of their experiences in the PLS in Warrnambool, I think this is a particular privileged sample, just through good luck, if nothing else. In terms of maybe divided into three. In terms of Timor, I think it is representative. They are, the people applying for these jobs are very educated by the terms of their country, in terms of their country. And the third part of that, though, is I don't think that necessarily holds true for people from other sending countries. So in good business for an academic like me, there's further research to be done, and there's a lot of reaching out to be done to other researchers, Richelle Bailey amongst other people who are doing research on people coming from Vanuatu and that type of thing. I think those comparisons would be instructive. Thanks, Grant.
Cool. Next, I'll come to one in the chat raised earlier. Kerry Taylor-Leach says, it seems rather unfair for tertiary educated people to get the majority of places on this scheme when the work is intended for low and semi-skilled workers. And the whole scheme seems biased in favour of people who have a relatively high level of literacy and speak English. Or can they apply in Teton or a local language? Do you care to comment, Mike?
Sure, Kerry. Look, thank you. That's a great question. I'm not an economist, but it just seems to be the way economics works, isn't it? Sort of like the highest paying job sort of are going to be seized by people with the best means to do so, which in Timor-Leste is these sort of educated, polyglot young people. As it happens, in terms of the PLS, less so with the SWP, but in terms of this group, sort of someone who didn't have a reasonable degree of English, who didn't have a reasonable sense of how Australia worked, just would have a very difficult time getting along here. So, I mean, I don't know if it's quite unfair. I mean, it is, you know, unfortunate that there aren't more opportunities in Timor-Leste, but as I think I was saying, like one of the great things about this program is that the people participating in it do things which they otherwise couldn't have. And many of them, this involves getting more education or starting, having a bright business idea or something like that. So I don't see how it could be any other way. As I have said before, I am pushing, and I hope we can find a way for PLS workers who want to settle here in the longer term. Not all of them will, some of them do, but a lot of them talk about things like being able to access the Australian education system. So I think this is just a stepping stone for the people who are involved. I should just quickly say, with the seasonal worker program, which is fruit picking, it's a slightly different situation in that the work is much simpler and there's much larger numbers. So I've done a little bit of work with them too. And the people you find on the seasonal worker program actually do tend to be sort of a little bit less educated, and that's okay. Goodness me, sorry, one further thing, which I forgot to mention. These programs are employer driven, right? So everyone who's employed by the PLS, it's because somebody from Midfield Meat came to Dili and picked people out. So whether it's fair or not fair, you sort of can't expect an Australian employer to sort of pick someone who doesn't speak English. I mean, it's probably unfair to tell you the truth, but that's just the way the employment sort of market works, even here. Okay, Kerry, thank you so much. And I'm sorry if that wasn't the clearest response.
And next we have a verbal question. Anne, who is unmuted. Just please go in. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I was interested in your comment about the fact there were very few women, and I think it's understandable that in the meatworks it is mostly men, and I know there are a few women there. I have met some of those workers, but you know, I just wanted to point out that in the seasonal worker program, not in the agricultural section, which is what we always hear about, but in those that work in hospitality, we actually found that 40% were women, which is well more than the proportion of women in the program overall. So, you know, because I guess it's hospitality and housekeeping and stuff, it's seen as women's work, but they also preferred to do that. But one of my questions is, I mean, you talk about their support of custom and so on through the remittances and so on. But also, I think for the women that go on the seasonal worker program, their opportunity for benefiting themselves through actually changing customary attitudes towards women is very great. And it's much greater than, say, maybe some of the men are like entrenched into the idea that they are going to become the chiefs and the bosses within their family, their extended family. But the women are looking to sort of change that. So I think that the opportunity that Australia brings to some of those women is quite remarkable, and they really do change the way their expectations in life through doing it. And I wonder if you, have done any work as an anthropologist, which I'm not, have any insights into that.
Thanks, Anne. That's a great comment. You're absolutely right about all of it. In fact, one really interesting area of research, which I wouldn't be surprised if you're already sort of working on to some extent. Look, I have my doubts about the phrase, honestly, but people often talk about care drain. The phrase in the academic literature mostly comes from work in the Philippines, which, as you know, sends a lot of nurses and things overseas. And people sort of ask the question of what happens, when sort of labour migration becomes about these, stereotypically female roles, what happens to kids who are left at home? In the case of Timor-Leste, I think it's a particularly resilient society because, as you saw from that chart, most people aren't in formal employment. So there's always sort of endless aunties, sisters, grandmothers, you name it. Like, it really does take a village in Timor-Leste who can generally step into the gap. Generally, obviously everybody has different life circumstances. In terms of the PLS and women's changing attitude, that is, once again, a cause for further research. One thing that does occur to me, though, is that the SWP, the PLS, labour migration to Australia, labour migration to the UK, isn't the sort of first opportunity that women in Timor-Leste have sort of had. It seems to be sort of a progression. There's sort of like Indonesian feminisms, Timorese feminisms, sort of like this increasing idea that sort of women, ladies going to sort of Cuba and being educated as doctors and all that sort of thing. So I think what we're seeing here is just part of a much bigger picture. Goodness, you probably agree with me on that anyway, right?
Mike, we're just about at time,
okay,
but I've promised Gabrielle I would like to squeeze in her question. She's unmuted herself now. So let's just keep this one brief, though, because we are at time. We're just over. Both the question and the response, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was very positive. You can basically see my comment or question in the chat. You painted a positive picture, and I think the economic benefits to Timorese in Timor are there.
Yeah.
Many of my Timorese friends, I've worked in Timor a lot, feel that an underclass is being created a little bit in foreign countries where Timorese go to work. And I have friends working here in Australia who hardly speak English at all, who hardly mix with Australians, and even a friend in Oxford who's been there for several years, and he doesn't speak a lot of English because he mixes mainly with Timorese there. I'm just wondering if you've got a comment about that or any suggestions how that could be changed. Warrnambool sounds like a different situation. Thank you. Yeah,
Warrnambool's a different situation, but mostly just out of luck. It was good luck, not good management. Look, I think there's a few things going on there. Thank you so much for that great question, by the way. I think when we look at immigration more broadly, it's very normal for sort of birds of a feather to flock together when they get to sort of a place when they're newcomers, and generally as the generations remain, that slowly changes. I'm so shocking with names, but who's that amazing Timorese football player in the UK now? No, he's been all over my social media feed. So he's a young lad, ethnically Timorese, and he was born in the UK to parents who live there. So, that's probably one sort of example of how, as sort of generations stay in a place, they, sort of move out of their sort of original ethnic community. In terms of the SWP and the PLS, it's a bit of a different situation. The SWP are just here for 6 to 9 months. They're generally on a remote farm, and they're all as often as they're picking as much fruit as they possibly can. They're really just here to make money. They'll generally go to church on Sunday, sometimes not even that, and get to know some people, but that's about it in terms of mixing with the community. And people talk about how there should be more, but I'm not sure how that's really even practical if it's what the Timorese want. With the PLS, it's a totally different kettle of fish. People are here for 3 years, and integrating into the community is absolutely essential. Look, this is the worst. I first met these guys just after they'd arrived in Warrnambool, like 2.5 years ago or whatever it was, 2 years ago. They were all walking around in flip-flops and shirts, and like it was the middle of winter in Warrnambool and it was raining. They really just looked like fish out of water. They did this Timorese thing where you sort of like, you can turn the music on your radio and listen to it loudly while you're walking around, which is just sort of socially unacceptable in Australia. Fine, but sort of 2 years later, I go to visit them, and everybody has sort of the suitable Warrnambool clothes. Like they have headphones for the music, They've acquired cars, a lot of them. They can sort of tell you all the good beauty spots. They're, you know, at the Great Ocean Road each weekend sort of thing. So yeah, look, it's just, I think it's a process of time. And it's also a process. It also depends on how these programs are structured, with the very clear distinction between situations where we have people in the community for years and where we have just short-term visitors.
Speaking of time, Mike, we are definitely at time now. So huge thank you for presenting. A big thank you to everyone for joining us and for our discussion. I would just like to mention that these events, well, in fact, everything that you see us doing here at the Development Policy Centre on Labour Mobility and Pacific Economies is part of the Australian Government's Pacific Research Program. And we are grateful that they support us now and into the future in creating these critically important spaces for discussion. Okay. Our speaker for next month's Labour Mobility webinar will be ANU PhD student Natasha Turiyamoka, and she'll be presenting 8,000 seasonal workers by 2025 from Papua New Guinea. I very much hope that you can all join us then too. Please take care of yourselves, and until then, thanks again.
Ryan, just a real quick thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to stay on here and have a look at the chat to try and respond to questions in text. I've been too nervous to look at it while I'm talking. So
no worries.
If this thing stays on, I'll try and respond to people's text messages.
You've got them all, by the way. Yeah, I've managed to catch them all.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. I forgot it.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, bye-bye.